Good morning. Thank you for joining us on this beautiful Sunday morning service. However, we're recording on Saturday, but it's beautiful today too. Just have a couple of announcements to go over. Our ladies group kicked off on Thursday. We're going through the book When You Pray. It was great. We had about 5 of us in the morning, and then we had 10 of us on at night. So I think it's going to be a great study. It's not too late if you still want to get involved. We just went through the introduction. So let me know if you want to be a part of it. We'd love to have you join us. Today is our regular tithes and offerings and our mission Sunday. So you know the drill. You can go to thefathershouse.org, click on the giving button, set it up as a one-time gift or a recurring gift. I know Pastor Juan and Patricia are very appreciative of what we've been able to give to them last year and this year. Tax statements, I have those ready to go. I mailed some of them out. I handed some of them out. So I'll try and hand the rest out on Sunday. If not, I'll get it mailed to you. If there's something wrong, please let me know and I'll get it corrected for you for your taxes. Let's see. I think that's about all I have to cover today. So we'll turn the time over to Pastor Carl.
Well, good morning, Father's House. Glad you guys are here today. I'm glad I'm here today. Life is good, that's for sure. As Penny said, the weather's absolutely gorgeous, although you know as well as I do that we need rain. I mean, be in prayer that the West Coast gets rain, especially down in Southern California where those fires are still raging on, although they're getting them somewhat under control. We need to get them all the way under control. So anyway, be in prayer for that. But the weather has been great. Life's been great. I trust that your life is going well, as going well also, and that you are prospering in God, and that things are just generally good. Sorry, I've got this hay fever going because there's a lithium fire. I think it's lithium. Anyway, there's a plant in Moss Landing, which is just south, and it's kind of polluting the air, and it's kind of got me right now. So if I'm coughing and wheezing a little bit, at least you know why, you know what it is that's happening. It's a battery plant. So no, I'm good. So anyway, she was asking me if I wanted a throat lozenge, and no, I'm good. So we'll work through it. Hmm. So what are we doing here? Let's go ahead and talk a little bit more about what we've been talking about in the life of Samuel, and kind of really who this figure Samuel is. Some people would argue that other than Moses, Samuel is an ominous figure. That Moses may have been bigger, but Samuel's by far the second biggest dog up to date in this time, and really through all of the Old Testament. I don't know if that's true. There's no doubt that he was very much the largest of the two spiritual leaders, being Moses' spiritual leader, and also of Samuel being a spiritual leader. You could argue that you could put Abraham in there. Abraham is extremely significant, especially to the Christian faith, in our interpretation of what the Old Testament is saying. But that's for another day. But Samuel is definitely one of those big figures, and it's interesting because when you look at the life of Moses and you look at the life of Samuel, and you can look at it also in the life of Jesus. It's very interesting because all three of those figures are picked up from their birth and forward. And actually, the Annunciation and what was even said prior to their birth, when you think about Jesus and when you think about Samuel. So Samuel has really a lot to say to us. And I tell you that I could probably teach on Samuel for the next 2 years, and we could not exhaust all that we could learn about Samuel, even in the general sense, let alone if we really started breaking things down into the minute sense. But we talked about last week about the idea, and the week before that of Hannah, when Hannah was in this desperate state, and she prayed and she asked God for a son, and that she would give this son back to Jehovah, back to God, which she did. And she did that. And then last week we talked about that beautiful psalm or song of praise that she gave back to God. And if you didn't get a chance to watch that on Sunday night or Sunday day live stream, it's definitely worth watching. I kind of was able to expand a little bit more because I had more time. But I want to talk and I want to continue with that. So we kind of left it with When Samuel was given to the Lord, it says, and they worshiped the Lord there. And it really has the idea of worshiping the Lord both. It seems like in that text, I mean, it could have been Elkanah, but it was definitely Hannah, and it was definitely this boy, 3-year-old Samuel, that is worshiping the Lord. So what happens in, and we're going to pick up his life when he's about 12 years old. So there's going to be a lapse in history here. And we're going to pick him up when he's about 12 years old, and he has his first calling from God. And we're gonna pick that up in the third chapter of Samuel. And when he basically, for the first time in his life, he hears the voice of God. So this is how it reads. Now the boy Samuel was ministering to the Lord before Eli, and the word of the Lord was rare in those days, and visions were infrequent. It happened at that time, Eli was lying down in his place. Now his eyesight had begun to grow dim, and he could not see well. And the lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was lying down in the temple of the Lord, where the ark of God was. That was it was that the Lord called Samuel and said, "Here I am." Here, and I'm sorry. And the lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was laying down in the temple of the Lord, where the ark of God was. That the Lord called Samuel, and he said, "Here I am." Then he ran to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you called me." But he said, "I did not call you. Go lie down again." So he went and lay down. The Lord called yet again, "Samuel." So Samuel rose and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you called me." But he answered, "I did not call you, my son. Lie down again." Now Samuel did not yet know that the Lord know the Lord, nor for Samuel did not yet know the Lord, nor had the word of the Lord been revealed to him. So the Lord called Samuel again, and the third time, and he arose and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you called me." Then Eli discerned that it was the Lord that was calling the boy. And Eli said to Samuel, "Go and lie down, and it shall be, if he calls you, that you shall say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.'" So Samuel went and lay down in his place. Then the Lord came and stood and called as he did at other times, "Samuel, Samuel." And he said, "Speak, for your servant is listening." The Lord said to Samuel, "Behold, I am about to do a thing in Israel, at which both ears of everyone who hears it will tingle. In that day I will carry out against Eli all that I have spoken concerning his house from the beginning to the end. For I have told him that I am about to judge his house forever for the iniquity which he knew, because his sons brought a curse on themselves, and he did not rebuke them. Therefore I have sworn to the house of Eli that the iniquities of Eli's house shall not be atoned for by sacrifice or offering forever." So Samuel lay down until morning. Then he opened the doors of the house of the Lord, but Samuel was afraid to tell Eli about the vision. When then Eli called Samuel and said, "Samuel, my son." And he said, "Here I am." He said, "What is the word that he spoke to you? Please do not hide it from me. May God do to you, and also more, if you do hide anything from me, of all the words that God had spoken to you." So Samuel told him everything and hid nothing from him. And he said, "It is the Lord. Let him do what he seems is right and good to him." Thus Samuel grew, and the Lord was with him, and let none of his words fail. All Israel from Dan and even to Beersheba knew that Samuel was confirmed as a prophet of the Lord. And the Lord appeared again at Shiloh, because the Lord revealed himself to Samuel at Shiloh by the word of the Lord. Long text, I know. It's a long story. But this story has major significance in the life of Samuel. And ultimately, next week when we talk about it, we'll have really some major significance in the life of the nation as a whole. But it's interesting here because I picked this story and I left some stuff out before, which was in chapter 2, because I want to give a backstory as to what it is that happened at this time. At this time, it says that the word of the Lord and visions was very rare at that time in Israel. As a matter of fact, there really hadn't been any clear direction from the word of God or from God for the people of Israel, probably since Deborah, which was a judge before Samuel. ultimately became a prophet, and ultimately would become a judge. So there was this long span where the people hadn't heard from God. And the thing was, is that if you look at the life of the judges in Israel, which Samuel is and is becoming, is that it's like the judges would kind of lead the direction and it would give a prophetic voice on the way in which the people were to go to walk with God. But it was this circular thing. They'd make a commitment to God, they would walk with God, and then as time went on, they would fall away from God, get distracted from the things of God, not live the way that God wanted them to live. And they would kind of fall into this oppression, and they would fall into this place of just being kind of lukewarm with God. And God would then send a judge to redirect. So there's always this pattern of almost revival and apostasy, of this revival happening where people are hot for God, and then this cooling down period where people are kind of lethargic about the things of God. And really, kind of today, what we're seeing is, at least in the Bay Area, is we're seeing that people are very lethargic to God. Well, at this time when Samuel was a boy, it's very interesting because Samuel was given to the temple when he was 3 years old. As I said, now we're about 9 years later when the boy was probably 12 when this happened. So, what happened in between in those 9 years? And this kind of speaks to what we talked about last week when I talked about the divine economy, that there's a human economy and there's a divine economy. And we kind of talked about that sometimes what we do, even as Christians, is we trade in this human economy. So Phineas and Hophni were two of Eli's sons, and Eli was the priest at that time. And his sons were the attendants of the priest. And so what would happen is they would basically be the ones that would prepare the sacrifice for the offering before the offering was put on the altar and after the offering was put on the altar. Well, there was a law that comes really from the Levitical law, that the priests were entitled to eat of that offering under certain conditions, and those certain conditions were laid out as when they could take the meat, what meat they could take, and and how much of the meat that they could take. So what happened though with Hophni and Phineas is they were, it was said that they were evil men, and they were men by this time. And you've got this boy Samuel, and you've got these evil young men who are ministering in the house of God. But it says that what happened was is they were coming in, and before it was right for them to take the offering, they would stick a fork in it and pull off, and whatever they could pull off, they would take for themselves. And they were becoming very gluttonous of this sacrifice that was offered to God, not for their provision. And it got to the point where they were allowed to have boiled meat, and only and certain portions of it, but they decided they didn't want boiled meat anymore, but they wanted fresh meat so they could cook the meat however they wanted to take it. So when the offering was being presented by a person that wanted to make an offering to God, they would simply say, "Oh, before you make the offering of God," it would almost be like saying, if it was lambs, like, "Okay, before you make this offering to God, I want the rack of lambs, I want the lamb chops, and I want the leg of lamb. Oh, maybe I want the shake too. The rest of it you can burn." And the people would simply say, "No, that's not what God has commanded." And so what they would say is, "If you don't give it to me," meaning Phineas and Hophni, "if you don't give it to us, I'm going to tell you something. We're going to take it anyway because we're going to take it by force." And so there was this level of selfishness on those people that were supposed to be giving the oversight and the care of the most holy and sacred place in all of Israel, which was the temple. So we have this story of two different types. We have Samuel, and what's interesting is when these guys are being selfish, what we find out about Samuel is Samuel's on the complete opposite end. Now, maybe Samuel's on the opposite end because he's a young lad. These were older young men, and so being young men, they really didn't have anything in common with Samuel. But they certainly grew up in the same temple. They had their own quarters, and so they would oftentimes run into each other. But what's interesting in Samuel from the time he was a child, even through to where he is now, it says, "But Samuel ministered before the Lord. And Samuel ministered before the Lord and Eli. And Samuel worshiped and ministered before the Lord and before Eli." And so there was this idea of two different realities, two different worlds. And this is where the divine economy comes back into play in our life. The divine economy is simply this: Phineas and Hophni took what they wanted out of the temple sacrifice for themselves. In other words, the temple and the sacrifice and the world that they lived in became very self serving. They wanted what they wanted, even though it was God's. And so they would take what they wanted. It's almost like, if you put it in modern times, it would be like me as a pastor, for instance, that if I was a pastor, and I am a pastor, and as the offerings were coming in, I simply said, well, gosh, you know what? The offerings have come on. There's a lot of cash money here. I don't know why we've got to report it to anybody. Why don't you give me the cash money and I'll just take it for myself? And so I take the money. And at the same time, I take a paycheck, maybe from the church, whatever the case might be. And what I'm doing is I'm taking everything for myself for my own sustenance. But Samuel lived in a different economy. And the economy he lived on in was that he wasn't there to take the things from the temple for himself. He was there to minister in the temple to God. So we have one group of religious persons, or these attendants to the priest, who basically are living a selfish life, and they're not living their life as Samuel did, to attend to God. In the midst of this story, before we get to the story of Samuel, what happens is this prophet comes and starts talking with Eli the priest. And he tells Eli the priest, I'm going to tell you something. Your house is about to fall. And the reason your house is about to fall, now get this, is because you failed to reprimand your sons and put them in proper order regarding this temple and temple worship. And I'm going to tell you something. God is offended by that. And he's going to wipe out your house. He's going to remove you from the priesthood, and not a member of your household will ever stand as a priest again. Now, if you're Eli, you're listening to this and you're thinking to yourself, why? And he just kind of going, he's kind of blown away, I would think, by that, because basically what God's saying is, because you failed to reprimand your sons, I'm going to take the ministry from you. You're no longer going to, you're disqualified from ministering in my temple because of your son's selfishness. And the the idea is, and it's not that Eli didn't go and talk to his sons about it and reprimand it, but when he talked with his sons about it, there wasn't a consequence to his sons that would make them change their actions. And so it was almost like he looked the other way and let his sons do what they were doing. And it wasn't just the temple sacrifices. There was other things that was going on in these young men's life. But you see, these young men, when they were there for their own gain. They were there for their own ego, their own appetite. And sometimes that's kind of how we sometimes might want to choose to live our life. And it kind of comes about, well, what can God do for me? So finally, the day is going to come when God is going to do what he said concerning Eli and his sons. The prophet had spoken that probably many years before this, but there's two things that are happening here. The first thing is that God is training Samuel, and he's teaching Samuel how to hear his voice. And the second thing is he's now beginning to raise up Samuel, and in raising up Samuel is going to come, really, to some extent, at Eli and his son's expense, because Samuel is cut of a different fabric than Phineas and Hophni. Now, Phineas and Hophni could have taken the place of the high priest. But the reason that they couldn't take it is because there was a corruption in them that made them not qualified to minister to God. I want to talk about that in a minute. But the story of Samuel is quite interesting. So the scene is set in the temple. Then, if you go into the temple, as you come into the temple, there's the court of women. Then there's the court inside, where once you get into the court, the inner court, there's a place of sacrifice. There's different furniture that's in there. There's the brazen laver, and there's these candlesticks, or these lights of God. And at night, these candles would be lit, and so that they would lighten the inner sanctuary. And outside of the sanctuary was these quarters where the attendants, which would be when you're walking, let's say on the left-hand side, you would find the quarters for Phineas, Hophni, and for Samuel. On the opposite side would be the priest quarters, and that would be where Eli was sleeping. In between where the attendants were and where the priests were on the sides was in the very center of the temple. It was called the Holy of Holies, where the Ark of the Covenant was, and where the glory of God manifest its presence. It signified the glory and the presence of God with the people of Israel. So on the left-hand side, if you're facing where the Holy of Holies is, on the left-hand side, let's say you had Phineas and Hophni and Samuel. On the right-hand side, you had Eli, and in the middle was this place where God dwelt. Samuel's laying down, and as Samuel's laying down, he all of a sudden he hears this voice, Samuel, and he wakes up, and he's a little bit startled, and he's just doing what he's attending the lights and doing whatever, but getting a little bit of rest. And he says, I think Eli's calling me. So he runs around to where Eli is, and when he runs around to where Eli is, he says, Sir, Eli, you called me? Master, you called me? He said, I didn't call you. Go back to bed. You must just be hearing something. And it says, scripture says that this happened 3 times. And so you can almost see that you got Samuel, he's kind of laying down trying to get some rest, and he hears this voice, Samuel. Oh, Eli's calling me. And he goes, no, it's not Eli. Goes back. And Samuel's probably thinking, I don't get it. I mean, is Eli like, is he calling out my name because he's dreaming? He's calling me? What's the deal? And yet, he thinks he thinks that I'm dreaming. I think he's dreaming, but obviously something is happening. After the 3rd time, Eli begins to realize that Samuel is hearing something, and he realizes that he's hearing the very voice of God. So he says, go back and lie down. And the next time you hear the voice, simply just say, speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. So Samuel goes and lies down, and scripture says he didn't call his name once, but he called his name twice. He said, Samuel, Samuel. And he says, speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. At that time, when that happens, it says that the Lord appeared to him, and he told him what we read the story about, all these things that were going to happen to Eli and his sons. And it said that the people of Israel's ears were going to tickle. The hair on the back of their neck is going to stand up with what was about to happen in Israel. And so what the interesting thing about this is that what Samuel was hearing was the voice of God from the very Ark of the Covenant, the very seat or mercy seat of God. He thought he was hearing it all the way across the room, that it was Eli, but it wasn't. It was in the center. And at the center was God's voice for the first time, speaking to Samuel when he's 12 years old, basically saying, Samuel, Samuel, get up. I want to talk to you. I want to tell you what's about to happen in Israel. And so what we find in this story, and I'm going to kind of cut it off here today, and we'll pick it up as it kind of moves forward, is because I'm building on something here, is the first thing is we talked last week about a divine economy, that there's the economy of God and there's the economy of man. Men look in the natural world, they see problems, they see things, and what happens is they either have fear. I mean, they just live in this natural world, whether it's fear, whether it's selfishness, whatever the case might be, and they never really look to see what it is that God's doing and what God is establishing. But there's an economy within our Christianity. There's an economy in our spirituality where we begin to mature and we begin to grow when we look past ourselves, past our circumstances, past our needs and our wants and our desires, and we look to God in order to minister to God. The difference between Phineas and Hophni and Samuel was simply this. Phineas and Hophni wanted to know what it was that they could get from God, what they could get from serving God in the temple. On the other side was Samuel. Samuel didn't want to find out what he could get from God. What he did was he wanted to live his life saying, what can I give to God? And so the difference in the economies, We talked about the economy last week and about Hannah's prayer of lament, and the economy that when you transcend your own environment and you look to God and see that His goodness is going to see you through. In the same way of that transcendence, there's a spiritual principle that says we transcend and we begin to find God's voice and His involvement in our life. We're not asking God for what He can give to us, but we're asking God, how can we minister to you? How can we worship you? How can we better serve you? And I want to tell you something, that when we begin to learn to serve God and we begin to care more about the things of God than the things of ourselves, everything falls in line. A lot of times we look for, wow, what kind of rewards am I going to get when I get to heaven? Wow, what kind of gifts are God going to give me? Wow, how's God going to make me prosper? God prospered me by giving me a new car, by giving me a new house, by giving me a new job. And we think somehow that the divine economy is tied as to what we can get from God, rather than those people that walk in maturity and say, everything that I need from God, God will supply. My job is to worship Him, to minister to Him, and to serve Him, and everything else will take care of itself. There's two different economies. What we're going to see in this economy is one's going to lead to death, and the other is going to lead to life. And the question we have to ask ourselves is, which economy do we want to live in? The economy where we transcend ourselves, we see things and other people as bigger than us and more important to us, and we serve God and serve them, or we become self-serving and serve ourselves for what we can get and what we want and what we think we need. I want you to think about that today. I'm going to go ahead and close this out because we're kind of running out of time. But I want you to think about that. If you want to join us tomorrow for our live stream, which will be Sunday morning, love to have you join us, and we'll talk about it maybe a little bit more in detail then. But I ask you just to think about, what economy is it that you want to live in today? God bless. Have a great rest of your week.